A person buys a movie online. Years later, the platform removes it, and suddenly the movie they paid for no longer exists inside their account. A driver finances a car for 7 years, but before the car is even fully paid off, the company releases a newer model. New features become mandatory. Monthly payments continue, and the cycle starts again. A family spends decades paying for a house, but property taxes continue forever. Insurance payments continue forever. Maintenance costs continue forever. And if enough payments stop, the house can still be taken away. At first, none of these situations seem connected, but underneath the surface, they all point toward the same transformation quietly reshaping modern life. Ownership itself is slowly disappearing, not through force, but through convenience, through subscriptions, through financing, and through systems designed to turn permanent ownership into permanent payments. Because modern corporations discovered something extremely important. Selling access forever is far more profitable than selling something once. And over time, that single realization quietly transformed the entire economy. Today, people stream instead of owning music, rent software instead of buying programs, lease phones instead of keeping devices, finance cars longer than ever before, subscribe to entertainment, subscribe to storage, subscribe to cloud systems, until eventually, modern life itself becomes a collection of recurring monthly payments. And the strange part is, most people barely noticed this transformation while it was happening, because each individual payment looked harmless on its own. A few dollars here, a small subscription there, until eventually entire lifestyles became dependent on systems people no longer truly control. And once dependency becomes normal, ownership slowly starts feeling unnecessary, old-fashioned even, because ownership comes with responsibility, repairs, maintenance, storage, commitment. But access feels easier, at least in the beginning, and that's exactly why the shift became so powerful. Because modern systems no longer needed to force people away from ownership. People started giving it up willingly, one convenience at a time. But this transformation didn't begin with streaming platforms or smartphone apps. The foundation started decades earlier. After World War II, large parts of the economy were still built around ownership culture. People bought appliances and kept them for years. Furniture lasted decades. Cars were repaired repeatedly instead of constantly replaced. Homes represented long-term stability because ownership itself meant security. But over time, corporations began realizing something uncomfortable about ownership. Ownership has limits. Once customers fully own durable products, revenue eventually stops. A refrigerator that lasts 30 years is great for consumers, but not ideal for endless corporate growth. A product people repair themselves creates fewer future sales opportunities. And gradually, the economy began shifting away from permanence, toward recurrence, toward upgrades, toward financing, toward subscriptions, toward ecosystems designed to keep consumers continuously connected to ongoing payments. Technology accelerated this transformation dramatically, because digital systems changed the meaning of ownership itself. For most of human history, ownership was physical. If you bought a book, you owned the book. If you bought a CD, you owned the music. If you bought a tool, it belonged to you permanently unless somebody physically took it away. But digital systems introduced something completely different: licensing. Now, people often don't truly own the products they pay for anymore. They purchase limited access under corporate-controlled terms. Movies disappear from libraries. Games stop functioning when servers shut down. Software requires subscriptions. Accounts get banned. Digital purchases become revocable. And suddenly ownership itself becomes conditional, not permanent. Conditional. And because the shift happened gradually, most people adapted without resistance, especially because convenience improved alongside dependency. Streaming was easier than physical media. Cloud storage was easier than hard drives. Subscriptions reduced upfront costs. Financing made expensive products feel affordable immediately. And psychologically, monthly payments feel smaller than large one-time purchases, even when the long-term cost becomes far higher. That's one reason financing exploded across modern economies. Cars became longer loans. Phones became payment plans. Furniture became installments. Luxury became accessible through debt. And eventually, even basic necessities increasingly moved into recurring payment systems. But underneath all of this sat a deeper economic incentive quietly shaping the entire system. Predictable recurring revenue. Investors love predictability. Corporations love predictability. And ownership creates uncertainty because eventually customers stop paying. Subscriptions solve that problem. Instead of selling one product once, companies create long-term customer dependency. Instead of convincing customers to return occasionally, the payment becomes automatic, continuous, invisible, and once millions of people enter recurring payment systems simultaneously, revenue becomes far more stable, which dramatically increases corporate valuations. That's why so many industries aggressively move towards subscription models at the same time. Software companies did it, entertainment companies did it, automobile companies started exploring it, even basic products increasingly adopted recurring service models. Because modern capitalism slowly realized something incredibly powerful. The ideal customer is no longer someone who buys once. The ideal customer is someone who keeps paying forever. And once that mindset spreads across entire industries, the structure of everyday life itself begins changing underneath the surface. Housing became one of the clearest examples of this transformation. For decades, home ownership represented one of the primary paths toward long-term stability. But over time, prices rose faster than incomes. Institutional investors entered housing markets. Private equity firms began purchasing large numbers of homes. Renting expanded, and younger generations increasingly found themselves locked out of ownership entirely. Meanwhile, rents continued rising, creating permanent monthly extraction systems across entire cities. And once housing shifts from community stability toward investment optimization, the consequences spread everywhere. People delay families, delay savings, delay ownership itself. And entire generations begin existing inside systems where permanent payments become normal life conditions. But housing isn't the only area where this pattern emerged. Modern technology companies increasingly discovered they could maintain control even after products were purchased. Smart devices require accounts. Cars now contain software restrictions. Printers reject third-party ink. Phones become difficult to repair independently. Devices are sealed shut. Replacement parts are restricted. And software updates quietly push consumers toward upgrades faster than before. This is where ownership starts becoming psychologically strange, because consumers may physically possess products, while corporations still maintain significant control over functionality, over repairs, over access, over lifespan. And once products become deeply connected to centralized software systems, true independence becomes harder to maintain, because modern products increasingly rely on ecosystems rather than standalone ownership. Your files live in clouds. Your communication lives on platforms. Your work exists inside subscriptions. Your entertainment exists on servers you do not control. And your access to all of it depends on maintaining continuous participation inside corporate systems. That's what makes this transformation historically important, because previous economic systems mostly focused on ownership transfer. Modern systems increasingly focus on access management, and access can always be modified. restricted, priced differently, or removed entirely, which creates a level of dependence previous generations rarely experienced at this scale. But perhaps the most powerful part of this transformation is psychological, because eventually people stop expecting ownership altogether. A generation raised entirely inside subscription systems may eventually see permanent ownership as unrealistic or unnecessary. And once expectations shift, resistance weakens automatically, because systems become normalized through repetition. Monthly payments become life itself. Leased cars, rented apartments, subscription entertainment, borrowed money, financed consumption, all continuously connected to recurring income streams required to maintain access to modern life, which creates a very different type of society underneath the surface. A society where participation matters more than ownership. A society where access can be interrupted at any moment. And a society where individuals increasingly depend on centralized systems simply to maintain ordinary daily living. Now, to be fair, not all subscriptions are bad. Not all financing is harmful. Many of these systems genuinely improved convenience, reduced barriers, expanded access. That's what makes this transformation so complex, because the system often provides real benefits while simultaneously increasing long-term dependency underneath the surface. And historically, that's usually how the most powerful systems expand. Not by making life immediately worse, but by making life easier first, then slowly becoming difficult to live without later. That's the pattern: convenience first, dependence second, and once enough infrastructure becomes centralized, leaving the system becomes increasingly difficult because alternatives slowly disappear around it. That's why this conversation is larger than subscriptions themselves. It's really about the future relationship between individuals and systems of access. Because if ownership continues declining across major parts of life, then whoever controls access increasingly controls everyday existence itself. And once societies become deeply dependent on centralized systems for housing, transportation, communication, entertainment, work, and commerce, the balance of power quietly changes underneath the surface, not through visible force, but through invisible dependency. And perhaps the strangest part of all this is that many people still believe they are becoming more independent because modern technology feels personalized, flexible, customizable. But underneath all the personalization, many people are becoming more system-dependent than ever before in human history. Because true ownership creates distance from centralized control, while permanent access models increase connection to it, and slowly, without most people noticing, modern economies began shifting away from building owners toward building participants who continuously pay to remain connected to the systems surrounding everyday life. And in the next episode, we'll explore how modern technology transformed human attention into one of the most valuable resources on Earth, and why the battle for your attention may now be shaping politics, culture, business, and even reality itself underneath the surface.